Welcome to Conversations in a Vintage Shop, a podcast from behind my counter between customers. Join me while I sit behind my retail counter and just have a conversation with you, or with myself. While I look out the window, observe what I see, things that are happening in the store today, throughout the week, and just fun little stories that I have from my time as a business owner. This is something that you find interesting, then keep listening, and I appreciate you. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Conversations in a Vintage Shop, a podcast that I record live from my shop during shop hours. And every episode is a different topic, or sometimes I just like to talk about things that are on my mind. And I always preface every episode with this, but since I do record this during shop hours, you may hear some noise or music in the background, and that is my shop music and stereo system. So don't mind that. It's all a part of the ambiance. Now, it's been a while since my last episode, and in either that episode or the episode before, I kind of explained that I won't be doing weekly episodes anymore. I'll just be uploading whenever I get a chance to record an episode. And I know a lot of you out there listening, you know what I mean when I say burnout is real. I get overly ambitious. I get really passionate about things that I'm doing. But then I have to do all of them at once, and my cup does not runneth over, it's bone dry. But I got the motivation today to record this episode, and I'm looking through my notebook full of topics and episodes that I want to record, and I will eventually. I think once winter hits and I get a little bit of a breather, I'm probably just going to stockpile as many episodes as I can. But this episode, I wanted to talk about bad advice I got when I first opened my small business. I know I touched on this in a really, really early episode back in season 1 when I first started recording, but I wanted to circle back to it because it's been something that no matter how long you've been in business, you're always going to get someone coming into your shop or your space who's never heard of your shop before, didn't know you existed, and you have these same questions and conversations over and over again. And I thought it was really important to talk about it and how I handle it. If you're a customer going into a business, maybe what not to say, or if you think you're being helpful, but some things come off as just being really condescending, all that jazz. So I thought, why not? This would be a good opportunity to jump in there. And I know a lot of people who have been thinking about starting their own business, small business, whether it be graphic design, cleaning business, illustration, you name it. And I always just think about what are the things that I wish someone would have told me when I first started, what wasn't helpful, what did I run into? Because it's hard to navigate, especially depending on what kind of business you start. And being a vintage shop, again, is a very niche area, but one that has a lot of importance. Before I go deeper into that topic, I do just want to give a quick shop update. I want to share something that I'm very proud of that I did this month. And as I'm recording this, it's August, just for reference. I finally framed this green-worn Debbie Reynolds bra that I got at the last Julian's auction that I recently did a podcast episode on. And it's in this amazing double-sided shadow box. On view, has the name label inside of it, the MGM tag. And now I get to hang it up in my shop, and hopefully people ask questions about it and want to hear the history and the story. It took me forever to find the numbers that corresponded to what this garment was worn in, because I thought, well, maybe it wasn't even worn by anything. It was just a stock garment. I don't know. But in the episode, I tell everyone that it's from the 1953 film I Love Melvin, which came hot off the heels of her debut success in Singin' in the Rain. And now I found the actual scene that this was worn in, and I recently just put it up on my Instagram story. But it's a dance sequence where she has this gold lycra kind of wool bathing suit type costume and headpiece that makes her look like a football, because it's a football themed dance number. And it's a high neckline. You couldn't have straps show. And this bra was worn under that costume. And if you look up the film scene, I think the scene was before the game and it was a musical number. I have to write that down again, but it was really fun watching that whole scene and knowing that she wore this bra that has no stretch, no movement, and did all of those dance moves. It's definitely not like a sports bra we wear today. It must have been horrifically uncomfortable, but I was quite pleased about that. Maybe I'll do another episode updating kind of more information that I found on it. But there is going to be another Julian's auction coming up at the beginning of September that I'm gearing up for. I've been just stalking the auction page, writing down all of my favorites. I have my eyes set on a lot, so I'm hoping I get at least one item. Wish me luck, because if I do, that'll be a whole other podcast episode. But I wanted to share that win because I love film. I love film history, and combining my love of vintage, lingerie, costume, and film history in this one piece has just been the time of my life. I love it, and I can't wait to collect more. All right, so let's talk about bad advice I got as a small business owner. And when I say bad advice, it's a mix of professional advice. You know, you go into small business mentors, small business centers, and also advice I've received from other business owners and sometimes customers. Now, I preface this saying I love hearing what people think, if there's somewhere I can improve or something I'm not seeing that could really be a great help to my shop. That's how businesses grow. You have to listen and learn from others, but there's the difference between good constructive advice and advice that's just it's not good for anybody. And that's the kind of advice that I'm talking about. Now, thankfully, this is a short list, but one that I have a lot of feelings about. And the first is something I heard before I opened my brick and mortar, and something I still get to this day. And it's mainly from other small business owners and sellers. And I forgot to turn my phone off silent. But that is that I should only be doing e-commerce. I should not have a brick and mortar business, and I should focus all of my time and energy on just having an online only sale presence. Now, I get where this comes from, because especially in this retail market, things are changing. I mean, we all know the easy access of online shopping, Amazon, all of that is really taking over the retail field. And I mean, it's convenience. Let's face it. Life is hard. Life is busy. Funds aren't always there to shop in person. Sometimes it's not accessible if you can't make it into a shop. There are a lot of different factors. But from what I've experienced, the advice I've gotten along those lines are usually from people who do have an online presence, but also omit the fact that they have to do side businesses to keep that online business going. And a lot of times, none of them actually know that I used to be an online seller before I opened my brick and mortar. And again, broken record here, but I started an Etsy shop in 2012. And it was a way for me to make extra money after I graduated from college, pay off my loans, pay bills, clear out things that I'd been collecting that I no longer wanted anymore. And that was a side hustle because I couldn't make enough money from it to make it my full-time job. I would have loved that, but it just wasn't realistic. And especially back in 2012, Instagram had just sprung up, still in its early stages. Facebook didn't have marketplace or selling. There was no Meta, anything like that. So really, you depended a lot on the Etsy platform itself. So there, it probably would have been more realistic. Now, you fight against algorithms. You have to pay to get a lot of posts seen, especially if you're a business page. Fees. A lot of people don't realize this, especially if you're not a seller and you're a consumer who buys online, is whether it's Etsy, eBay, Pinterest, Depop, Poshmark, even if you have a Squarespace or Shopify, you pay fees for every sale. Some are more than others. So it's not a free way to sell. Of course, it's not as expensive as having brick and mortar. Totally fair point. But the reason why I left Etsy was because they were taking a huge chunk of what I made in sales. And eventually they started pushing free shipping. And if you didn't offer free shipping, your listings would get kicked to the back, harder to find. And as a seller, you had to contend with, all right, so I'm already getting, 20, 30, 40% fees taken out of my sale. You have a transaction fee. Someone pays through PayPal. That's another fee on top of it. And now I'm offering free shipping. And that, as we know now, shipping is increasing. That could be $7, $8, $9, $10, $11, $12 plus dollars taken out, which leaves you with not a very big margin. And e-commerce online selling is hard. It's hard. And I say this time and time again when I get people asking if I'm ever going to put more vintage up on my website. The good thing about having an online-only presence is you have a lot more time to photograph items, write really in-depth descriptions. But if you're like me and you run a brick and mortar as well, I have to fit it in where I have a free moment. I have to photograph, edit, mend, launder. I've been doing all my own mending on my pieces. You have to come up with a description, research the price, research the label. There's so much that goes into it. And especially in a brick and mortar, a lot of times they sell in store anyways. And the website is more of just a guide. So it's complex. And it's hard to balance. But selling online is not easy, even if it is your full-time job. It's not easy. And there are so many struggles with it. And the first being that I have not met a lot of sellers that can make selling online their full-time job. Unless they're selling really high-end, luxury, vintage items. It's very hard and it's only getting harder. And when I did sell online, I did have to work side jobs. And those would exhaust me and burn me out to the point where I wouldn't even have energy to do my online listings. And it's hard. But a lot of other business owners tell me that's where it's at. Do e-commerce. It's so much easier. You have all this time available. And you don't have to worry about brick and mortar. And for them, that may be true. But for me, I love when people come in and physically can touch items, see them in person. I like the environment that I create. I like meeting the people I'm selling things to. I love the stories. I love the environment and in-person sales, and I use e-commerce as a help to reach more people, direct people to more information if they want to see things online and pick them up in store. But it's really hard to do e-commerce only, and the business owners that ended up giving me a lot of this advice ended up just shutting down their websites anyways because it wasn't profitable for them and they had to work a second job. So that's probably one of the biggest things I've heard, especially post pandemic shutdown. And it's one that is it's a long-winded explanation as to why I don't do that. I could do that, but it would not be my full-time job. It would be a side hustle because I would not make enough money. And I am so happy for those that can make it their full-time gig because it's a lot of work and you need that time. But that's one of the number one things I've heard and probably the most prevalent. And maybe one day it can be a full-time gig, but it just doesn't sound interesting to me. And that's okay. I'm proud to admit that I love my brick and mortar, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Now, the second bit of bad business advice that I have received is something that I experienced a lot of when I worked at a small clothing store in downtown Fargo when I was in college and into my early 20s. I saw other businesses do this, and I know it's very, very prevalent, especially in non-vintage, modern clothing and gift boutiques. So I want to say this first. This is a very common practice. Do I think it's a good practice? No. Do I think it's ethical? No. Do I think it's right? No. But it's very common and accepted, but it doesn't mean I have to like it or agree with it. And that is the advice that as a business, vintage business who sells new vintage inspired decor, clothing, gifts, I should look at what other shops are selling, take note of what lines they have, and carry those in my shop. Now, what I mean by that is, let's say you go to your favorite downtown or favorite city, and they have a bunch of gift shops, clothing shops, and you walk into several of them and you notice that there are shops that have the same lines. They may have the exact same clothing line, the exact same purse line, soap line, you name it. And that repetition kind of waters down the experience because you start to see, oh, this shop carries the exact same thing that this other shop I was just at carries. And there are a lot of thoughts that can kind of flood through you. Whether it's, oh, I wonder if this is more expensive here, if I can get a better deal here. Or, oh, I guess what I'm buying doesn't seem to be as unique or special because one or two or three or several other businesses have it. It almost feels like a corporate level buying technique where you kind of just flood the market with certain things. And again, I don't know the science behind that, but it all goes back to trends. Which is why, a lot of modern women's clothing stores, and I have this conversation a lot with my customers, you see, sometimes they have the same aesthetic. They may not have the exact same brands or clothing, but their items all fall under the same umbrella of a certain color scheme, a certain style, a certain fit, which that's contemporary retail. You keep up with the trends. But where it gets really hairy is when a business has the exact same clothing line and the exact same items from said line. I've seen shops that carry the same line of clothing or line of gifts, but they don't carry the same products. which is a totally different conversation. I'm talking about you have the same identical items. Now, when I worked at this boutique in my college years and early 20s, I remember there was another small business in our area that would come in to the shop I was working at with a notebook, and they'd go around to all of the smaller maker lines that we carried. They'd write down what they liked, and then a couple weeks later, they would have the exact same products on their shelves. Now, to the average consumer, this may not seem like a big deal, but for a small business, especially in a small city, at that time it was definitely smaller than it is now, you eliminate a lot of your customer base that way, because you have lines and same items in a small area being sold at the same shops. And a lot of times what happens are those businesses have to drop the line because there aren't enough sales to divvy up between the stores, especially for such specific items. Now, you can go into the logistics of it and how it's just weird to want to carry the same things as other businesses. But people who have given this advice to me see it as, well, you see another shop doing it, so it must work for them, so you should do it too. And that way you can make money off of something that is already proven. Which, in small businesses, it's not like corporate retail. You have to be very, very careful, because that's the allure of a small business. You want to find things that you can't find anywhere else, or at the very least not within blocks of each other. But then you go into the actual ethics of it, and it just feels really icky and predatory. Now, accidents happen. Sometimes you may get the same clothing line or gift line. That's gonna happen. It's a small world, specifically for small businesses getting inventory. But when people tell you to knowingly go to shops and do that, it feels weird and icky. And I've had it happen on the other side where I've worked at businesses that's happened to, and it doesn't feel good. And just imagine that. Ethically, it's weird, and it negates the whole purpose of having a small business. You want things that no one else has. You want to create a shop that's different and unlike any others. Now, I know when I've had this happen to me in my shop, it's always hard because you start going through, do I let go of some of these lines that I've had for years if I know someone in my general area or vicinity is carrying them? What do you do? And there's no right or wrong answer to that. You kind of just have to do what you feel is best. But it's bad advice. And look at it this way. When you start a business or a project or an art piece or whatever it is that you do, you can only get so far taking from others, taking ideas from others, using other people's inspirations as your own. Because eventually you're going to have to stand on your own 2 feet, and you're going to have to come up with things yourself. You're going to have to find ways to make your business interesting and new and moving forward. Because if you're always trying to stay in line and in step with everybody around you, if they fail, you're going to fail, and you're going to have product lines that you can't get rid of. So I don't know if that makes sense. And again, it's a very behind the curtain take on it. And if you haven't worked retail before, it sounds really arbitrary, but in the small business realm, I find it just a disrespectful thing to do to another small business, but also in terms of business, a really dumb decision. especially if you're trying to make a name for yourself and make your own space in the retail environment. Again, this one isn't a super common one. I get it from business owners, and I have gotten it a couple times from customers, but not in the same way. I've had customers go, "You should carry this brand. I'd much rather buy it from you." But then it goes back to, well, but this other shop has it. I know it. And if I were to get it, then I would knowingly be ripping off another shop. I could be in the minority opinion about this. I'd be interested to hear what everybody else thinks. As a customer, do you find it weird, off-putting? As a business owner, has this happened to you? Have you done it? Do you have an insight to it that I don't see? Which is very possible, but that's just my take on it when I've experienced it from both sides. And again, right or wrong answer, that's completely up to you, but it's just what I've experienced and how I feel. Now, with this third piece of bad business advice I've received, this one I'm going to be throwing some facts out there for you. And this is going to be specific to the state of North Dakota. And that's a topic of sales tax. So as a little bit of a backdrop, in my shop, everything I sell, I have to charge 7.5% sales tax, excluding the grocery items that I stock, which are all my loose leaf teas. Every state is different. I know next to us in Minnesota, there's no tax on clothing items, which is amazing. Maybe one day our state will get there. But when I first started with my vintage shop, I sold online. And again, the laws have changed in the states regarding this. But back when I started selling, you didn't charge sales tax on items that were not being sold and shipped inside of the state that you were living in. Not going to go too deep into that, especially the online format. But when I started selling at markets and in person, that's when it changed. Now, when I first started, there was, I believe the rule at the time was that if I was making over $600 in sales a quarter, that's when I had to start charging sales tax and reporting it to the state. Now, when I did my little vendor shows here and there, my little sales here and there, I didn't come close to that, so it wasn't a big deal. But then once you start making more sales, I did more in-person events, I opened a brick and mortar, my sales tax revenue was definitely increasing. And as a small business who didn't get any loans, any financial help, and was doing a lot of it out of pocket, the extra money you get from sales tax really does make a difference. And I know a lot of business owners have said and told me when I first started out, just don't separate your sales tax from your regular sales account. Just keep them all in there. Use that as cash on hand. And then when you have to report and write the check, then just take it out of your main account. Which, if your sales are low enough, at the end of a quarter, if you have to pay maybe $400 in taxes, it's relatively low considering, and probably easier to do. But as your business scales and starts to grow, that's when it gets different. So when I would get the advice to not separate my sales tax from my actual account, I immediately got a little panicked because I didn't know what that meant. I thought all businesses did that. And so when I hired my accountants, that was something that we had talked about. And it was a very common thing that they heard as well, especially working with small businesses, is a lot of small businesses didn't set aside the money they were getting for sales taxes. come the end of the quarter, once you get your invoice for how much you have to pay the state for your sales taxes, when you get up into the thousands, it's a very painful amount to have to take out on hand if you didn't set it aside. Thankfully, I had other people around me whose advice was much more sage, and thankfully with Square, they have an option where you can have your own savings account, separate accounts for money. So all of my sales taxes that I charge on all my items immediately just goes into that account. It's a separate account I use for sales taxes only, so that at the end of the quarter, I have all that money there, and my accountants send it straight to the state. It's money that I never really even had to begin with, which makes it easier. But taxes, I've noticed, especially for small businesses in any industry, but really in my field as well, can be difficult and intimidating. I've seen a lot of this on the market circuit when I did more vintage markets, seller markets, is that a lot of the vendors that I was with would just not charge sales tax on their sales during the night of those events for various reasons. But the fact is, it is an added cost that at markets, you're used to going to a farmer's market. And again, I'm talking out of the state of North Dakota, where you go to a farmer's market and you don't get charged tax because it's a grocery item. And I think sometimes people forget that with clothing, gifts, things like that, it's a whole different set of rules. So to make it easier, I know a lot of vendors I've worked with just eliminate that. Now, the bad part of that is if your business was to ever get audited, which I know my accountants told me that in the life of a small business, if you especially make it past 5 years, you're going to get audited at least once. And unless you have very good receipts and reasons why you didn't collect tax, you're liable to pay that. And if it's something that a business habitually does, that's really, really, really going to add up. But then also, too, again, in the state of North Dakota, any in-person sales, whether you're a remote seller, you must charge that sales tax, including the local sales tax option, the same as sellers who just have a brick and mortar. So if I'm in a state that's not North Dakota that does charge sales tax, I am selling in that state, someone is buying in that state, at least by the guidelines of what North Dakota does, you have to charge the sales tax. Now, I'm not an accountant. I'm sure I get some of these things wrong. But that's part of having a small business, is being accountable for the things that come with it. And I've seen a lot of pop-ups and people getting into small businesses that don't see the bigger picture in terms of sales tax and accounting more for what you're charging and where that money is going, because it will come back and bite you. Especially if you're not setting aside that money. It adds up a lot. And trust me, the last thing as a small business that you want to do is in slow months, because I know our retail quarter, I believe, is January, February, March, and towards the end of March is the cutoff. And so you have slow retail months. And if you all of a sudden get slapped with a $3,000 gross receipt for sales taxes you have to pay in, that hurts. And in a lot of small businesses, that's going to be felt. So that was a piece of bad advice that I understand why small businesses do it. Because when you're first starting out, it's hard. Every dollar counts. But trust me, in the long run, you're saving yourself a lot of stress and worry and grief if you just separate it. And again, I don't know if Shopify or any of those platforms have the same thing, but with Square, they do have, and again, this isn't sponsored. I feel like I have to say that because I'm talking about it so much. But with Square, they do give you the option to start your own checking and savings account. And I set mine to 7.5% of all credit card sales. Cash sales, I just put in that cost of it, which usually evens out. It's not too bad. But just set it aside, and it's, again, like you never had it. It's money that you never had to begin with, and it goes straight into that account and then off to the state. So I'm remedying that bad advice with good advice. Utilize the free services that you have through whatever POS systems or with your bank. Do yourself a favor. Just keep those separate. You will thank me at the end of a quarter when you have to pay in. Trust me. I hope a lot of that made sense. I think I got to ramble a little bit. I'm recording this later at night than what I normally do. I normally record these early in the morning when I'm awake and fresh and full of ideas. But I'm recording this later at night where I've let the day eat away at my ambition a little bit. And the bitterness and jaded feelings have started to set in. But I hope that makes sense. And I could really go on and on about the bad advice I've gotten, but I would get repetitive. These are the three that, especially as a vintage shop owner, are the number one things I've heard. And bad advice is everywhere. There are people that say these things and give you advice because they mean well, but again, the road to hell was paved with good intentions, or so the saying goes. But if you're at a small business and you see something that needs to be changed, and we've all done this, I've done this, you want to help. If it's your favorite store, your favorite small business, and you have an idea or something that you think could help them, and because you want to see them stay around, I get it. But in the world of small business, like small micro business, just keep in mind that a lot of times the business owners, the sellers, the artists, your idea that you think is a great idea is probably one they've heard a lot. And there comes a point where it does get stressful and it gets to be a lot. And small business owners face a lot. We get a lot of even just instances day to day that are mentally taxing, but you throw in there people giving you advice, especially advice that wasn't solicited. Just know you're not the only one that said that to them. Trust me. It may mean well, but if they don't ask, don't give it. But I hope that helps. And regardless of what kind of small business you're in, I'm sure things are different in all industries, but again, this is advice that I'm really happy that I didn't follow. And I still have to explain myself a lot when this advice is still given. But just know, use your first instinct. Just because someone is giving you advice doesn't mean you need or should take it, and it doesn't mean it's good advice. Look at the source, look at the circumstance, and just go with your gut. Because again, your first instinct is usually always the right one. I'm happy to say that this episode has been a little bit shorter than all of my hour-plus long episodes in the past. I really tried to keep this one concise, especially because I've been picking up on a podcast that I normally would listen to if I was on a road trip or had a long drive. And it's this podcast called You Must Remember This, which goes over Hollywood film history. I'm a big film buff. Turner Classic Movies and the host Robert Osborne raised me. That was my youth. I was taught well. And it's a great podcast. But when I was listening to it, there were episodes that were an hour plus long that I could never get through unless I sat down and listened to it or I was on a really long car ride. But lately I've been skipping around and finding episodes that were 30, maybe 40 minutes, which typically I can listen to on my way to work or when I'm running errands. So I'm trying to be more cognizant of that, I promise. But to end this episode, this is going to be something that's a little random, and it's coming out of nowhere. But on my personal Instagram page, I always like to do little weekend updates of movies I'm watching. Sometimes I make my Sunday nights silent movie nights, or watching a classic film that I've never seen before, or I'm watching for the first time. So at the end of this episode, I just want to tell you what I've been watching lately, and movies that I think you should watch, that you may enjoy. And the first one is, I think it was filmed released in 1944, but starring Ingrid Bergman and Charles Boyer, the classic film noir, Gaslight. Now, fun tidbit, that's a therapy term that you hear a lot lately. But back then, this wasn't an actual coined term until after this movie. And it references manipulative behavior. And this film is wonderful. I remember seeing it as a kid, watching it at my grandparents' house, and my grandma always saying, I had such a crush on Charles Boyer, who had a very interesting and tragic life. But that film is just so wonderful. And I watched it because in the next Julian's auction, there is a garment that was worn and owned by Ingrid Bergman up for sale. And I've just been getting really deep into that lately. But please, if you've never seen the film Gaslight, watch it. It's wonderful, classic black and white film. You won't regret it. But I also watched, kind of on the other end of the spectrum, the film They Live. Now, They Live is kind of one of those cult films that I've been seeing referenced more in the past 5-10 years than I ever did growing up. And this film is a sci-fi action thriller that was released in 1988 by horror legend John Carpenter. Now, the interesting thing about this film is it was more of a take on Reaganomics. It was a very politically nuanced film that centers around media and government and how they use subliminal messaging to control the population. And who is the one doing all of the control? The social elite. But who are the social elite? Scary, skull-faced aliens that can only be seen by one individual who found a pair of sunglasses that when you put them on, you can see them in their original form. Now, is it the best movie I've ever watched? No. It was one I had to keep struggling to watch to the end. If you're a wrestling fan, it stars Roddy Piper. But the message behind it's actually really interesting, and I find a lot of the imagery is very, very striking. So those are the two that stand out the most right now. And if you haven't seen them or are interested about them, take a look. Two very different films, but two that I think are really important, whether you're a film buff or you're someone that just likes history and something to have a conversation about afterwards. But I'm going to end it on that. And I appreciate you all. sticking with me for another episode. Seems to be I'm doing these months in between. And again, I don't know when the next one will be uploaded. I have a list of things I want to talk about. But I appreciate you coming back on my crazy, weird schedule. And thank you for listening, and I hope any of what I talked about interested you or helped in some way. Again, thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.